It was a warm Saturday morning, the kind of day that seemed tailor-made for browsing through other people's forgotten treasures at neighborhood yard sales. Mary and John, a middle-aged couple with a knack for stumbling upon oddities, meandered through rows of tables laden with trinkets and knickknacks. The atmosphere carried the faint scent of cut grass and old books, mingling with the distant sound of children laughing in a nearby park. They weren't looking for anything in particular, just killing time, enjoying each other's company as they often did on weekends. Mary had already picked up a small porcelain vase and an old tin advertising sign, both destined for the cluttered but cozy corners of their home. Meanwhile, John found himself drawn to a crate of vinyl records, flipping through them half-heartedly, his thoughts wandering. Then it happened. Mary froze mid-step, her gaze locking onto a small, unassuming stack of books on a rickety wooden table. Nestled among faded romance novels and outdated cookbooks was a worn, emerald green hardcover. The book's cracked leather binding seemed to glisten under the dappled sunlight, its gold lettering on the spine catching her eye. "John," she called softly, her voice carrying an unusual urgency. He turned, curious, and followed her gaze. "This one, it feels different," she said, almost shyly, as though afraid he might laugh at her intuition. But as John walked over and picked up the book, he, too, felt something. The leather was cool and smooth to the touch, the kind of texture that spoke of both age and care. The book seemed heavier than it should have been, as though it carried not just paper, but something intangible, history, perhaps. "What's so special about it?" John asked, but his tone lacked skepticism. He could see it in Mary's face. This wasn't just a random find to her. Carefully, she opened the cover, revealing an old, yellowed page that seemed to whisper of another time. What they saw made them both pause, their breath catching in their throats. Scrawled in elegant, looping handwriting on the inside cover was a dedication to Henry and Beatrice. "May this book guide your hearts as it has mine." Below it a date, 1912. And below the date, an ornate signature, though the name was hard to decipher. Mary's eyes widened. "Henry and Beatrice," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Those names, aren't they in your family's records?" John blinked, his mind racing. He vaguely remembered his grandmother mentioning those names once or twice in passing, though the details had always been hazy. "Yeah," he said slowly, they're connected to my dad's side of the family, I think." But how could this? His voice trailed off, unable to complete the thought. The yard sale vendor, a bored teenager scrolling through his phone, didn't seem to care when they asked about the book's origins. "No clue," he said with a shrug. "Came out of my grandparents' attic. $3 if you want it." Mary and John exchanged a look. It wasn't the money, it was the mystery. They paid without hesitation and walked back to their car, the book clutched tightly in Mary's hands. As they drove home, the air between them was thick with unspoken questions. Mary turned the book over and over in her lap, her fingers tracing the edges of the binding as though searching for answers. "This can't be a coincidence," she said finally, breaking the silence. "I mean, what are the odds that we'd find this? And here, of all places." John didn't reply right away, but he felt it too, that strange, inexplicable pull toward the book. It wasn't just a random purchase. It felt almost predestined, as though they had been meant to find it. By the time they got home, the book had become the focal point of their thoughts. Mary cleared a space on the kitchen table, setting the book down gently as though it might shatter. They stared at it for a moment, neither one quite ready to open it again. Finally, Mary broke the silence. "Let's see what's inside," she said, her voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. John nodded, pulling up a chair beside her. The first few pages were ordinary enough: an index, a preface, and the beginnings of an anthology of classic poems. But as they turned the pages, something unusual began to emerge. In the margins, Written in the same elegant handwriting as the dedication were notes, small, meticulous annotations that seemed to reference events, places, and people. "Look at this," Mary said, pointing to a line underlined in one of the poems. Beside it was a note, July 14th, the picnic. Her smile like sunlight on water. John furrowed his brow. "It's like someone kept a diary in the margins of this book," he said, his voice filled with wonder. They kept flipping through, finding more notes, some poetic, some cryptic, and others heartbreakingly personal. One page contained a single sentence scrawled in bold letters. "We must never forget, no matter the cost." The words sent a chill down Mary's spine. By the time they closed the book, the sun had begun to set, casting long shadows across the room. They sat in silence, the weight of the discovery settling over them. Mary finally spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "John, this book isn't just a book. It's a piece of your family." He nodded slowly, his mind reeling with possibilities. Who had written the notes? What did the dedication mean? And why had the book ended up in a random yard sale, so far removed from their family's history? The questions were endless, and the answers seemed just out of reach. But one thing was certain: their lives had just been irrevocably changed by a $3 purchase. They didn't know it yet, but the journey they were about to embark on would take them deep into the past, unearthing secrets and truths that would forever alter their understanding of family, love, and legacy. The following morning, Mary woke up before John, her thoughts still consumed by the green, leather-bound book. She tiptoed into the kitchen, careful not to wake him, and placed the book on the table once again. The soft morning light filtering through the curtains gave the worn cover an almost ethereal glow. She hesitated for a moment before opening it, as though fearing what she might find, or worse, what she might not find. With a deep breath, she began flipping through the pages once more, her fingers brushing over the delicate yellowed paper. This time she noticed details she had missed the night before, tiny indentations on the edges of some pages, as though they had been turned and handled countless times, faint stains, perhaps from tea or ink, and most intriguing of all, a barely noticeable bulge in the middle of the book. It was as though the book itself was urging her to delve deeper. When John finally joined her, rubbing the sleep from his eyes and clutching a cup of coffee, Mary was already fully engrossed. "You're up early," he remarked, his voice still groggy. She looked up at him, her eyes alight with excitement. "John, there's something more here. I can feel it." He chuckled softly, taking a seat beside her. "You sound like you're on the verge of discovering buried treasure," he teased. But his smile faded when he saw the seriousness in her expression. "I'm not kidding," she said firmly. "Look at this." She pointed to a particular page where a small star had been drawn in the margin, alongside a note that read, "The first key is always hidden." John leaned in, his curiosity now fully piqued. "What does that mean?" he asked, his voice a mix of intrigue and skepticism. Mary shook her head. "I don't know, but I think we're meant to find out." Together, they began examining the book more closely, turning each page with meticulous care. It wasn't long before they stumbled upon something extraordinary, a faint seam running along the inside of the binding. "Do you see that?" Mary whispered, her heart pounding. John nodded, his fingers tracing the seam. It's like there's something inside," he said, his voice barely audible. They exchanged a glance, the same unspoken question passing between them. Should they open it? With trembling hands, John fetched a small letter opener from the drawer. "Are you sure about this?" he asked, his voice tinged with hesitation. Mary nodded resolutely. "Whatever's in there, we were meant to find it." Carefully, John slid the blade along the seam, prying it open with painstaking precision. The old leather gave way reluctantly, revealing a hidden compartment within the spine of the book. Inside was a small, folded piece of parchment, its edges brittle and discolored with age. Mary gasped softly as she reached for it, her hand shaking. "What is it?" John asked, leaning in closer. Mary unfolded the parchment slowly, her breath hitching as she read the words written in the same elegant handwriting that had penned the dedication. "To the keeper of this book, know that you hold not just words, but the story of a legacy. Follow the stars, and you will find the truth." Beneath the message was a series of numbers, written in a neat, precise script. 47.3292 minus 122.5807. "What in the world?" John murmured, his brow furrowed in confusion. "Those look like coordinates," Mary said, her voice barely above a whisper. John stared at her, his mind racing. "Coordinates to what?" he asked, his tone equal parts curiosity and apprehension. Mary shook her head, her gaze fixed on the parchment. "I don't know," she admitted, "but whoever wrote this wanted someone to find them. And no, it's us." The weight of the discovery hung heavily between them, the air in the room thick with unspoken possibilities. Over the next few hours, they worked together to piece together what little information they had. John entered the coordinates into an online map, which led to a remote location in Washington state, an area neither of them had ever visited. "This doesn't make any sense," he said, shaking his head. "Why would there be coordinates hidden in a book that somehow ended up at a yard sale in our neighborhood?" Mary stared at the map on the screen, her mind churning. "Maybe it's a place they wanted us to go," she suggested. "Or maybe it's where the story began." As the day wore on, they found themselves more and more drawn into the mystery. The notes in the margins of the book, once cryptic, now seemed to take on new meaning. One passage in particular stood out to Mary. "The past is never lost. It waits to be found." She read the words aloud, her voice tinged with emotion. "Do you think this is about your family?" she asked, looking at John. He shrugged, but his expression was thoughtful. "If it is, then why now? Why us?" he wondered aloud. The question hung in the air, unanswered. That evening, as they sat together on the couch with the book resting between them, Mary spoke up again. "I think we need to go," she said firmly. John looked at her, surprised. "Go where?" he asked. She gestured toward the coordinates on the screen. "There," she said. "If this book is connected to your family, then we owe it to them, and to ourselves, to find out why." John hesitated, the weight of the decision pressing heavily on him. But deep down, he knew she was right. This wasn't just about curiosity or adventure. It was about something far deeper, something that felt almost sacred. As they made their plans, the book sat quietly on the table, its secrets still largely untold. But Mary and John both knew that it was more than just an object. It was a key, a guide, and perhaps even a test. Whatever lay ahead, they were ready to face it together. And as the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the room in shadows, they couldn't shake the feeling that their journey was only just beginning. By the time the weekend rolled into Monday, Mary and John's ordinary lives had been completely upended. What had begun as a casual purchase at a yard sale now felt like the opening chapter of a grand, unfolding mystery. The coordinates hidden within the book pointed to a small, forested area just outside a sleepy town in Washington state. It was a place they'd never heard of, much less visited, but the allure of the unknown and the possibility of uncovering a piece of John's family history were too compelling to ignore. As they packed for the trip, their home was abuzz with a mix of excitement and nervous energy. "This is crazy," John muttered, zipping up his overnight bag. Mary, rifling through a drawer for a flashlight, glanced up at him with a small smile. "Maybe," she said, "but isn't it the kind of crazy we'll regret not chasing?" Her words hung in the air, and John found himself nodding. She was right. The drive to Washington took 2 days, giving them plenty of time to speculate about what they might find. Mary, ever the optimist, imagined a hidden treasure, Perhaps an old family heirloom buried beneath a tree or a long-lost cabin filled with artifacts. John, more grounded in his expectations, leaned toward the idea of a forgotten grave or a memorial marker. Whatever it is, he said as they crossed the state line, it's something someone wanted to preserve. Otherwise, why go to all this trouble? Mary nodded, her fingers tracing the edge of the book, resting on her lap. Maybe it's not about the thing itself, she mused. Maybe it's about the story it tells. When they finally arrived, the coordinates led them to a dense patch of forest just off a narrow gravel road. The area was secluded, with only the occasional sound of birds and the rustling of leaves breaking the silence. Mary clutched the book tightly as they stepped out of the car, scanning the surroundings with a mix of awe and trepidation. "It's beautiful," she whispered. John, unfolding a map they had printed before leaving, nodded in agreement. "Peaceful too," he said. "But where do we start?" They decided to follow the coordinates exactly, using a GPS app on John's phone to guide them deeper into the woods. The air grew cooler as they walked, and the trees seemed to close in around them, their branches intertwining like the pages of a forgotten storybook. After nearly an hour of trekking, they arrived at the exact spot the coordinates pointed to. It was an unremarkable clearing, dappled with sunlight and surrounded by towering pines. At first, there was nothing to suggest that this place held any significance. Mary turned in a slow circle, her brow furrowed in confusion. "This can't be it," she said. "It's just empty." John knelt down, running his hands over the forest floor. "Wait," he said suddenly, his voice sharp with excitement. "There's something here." He brushed away the leaves and dirt, revealing a small weathered stone embedded in the ground. Etched into its surface were the initials HB, followed by a date, 1876. Mary knelt beside him, her heart pounding. "HB," she murmured. "Henry and Beatrice." John nodded, his mind racing. "It has to be," he said. "But why here? And what happened in 1876? As they examined the stone, Mary noticed something else, a faint arrow carved into the edge, pointing toward a nearby cluster of trees. "Look," she said, pointing it out. Without hesitation, they followed the direction of the arrow, their footsteps crunching softly against the forest floor. It led them to an old, gnarled oak tree, its massive roots twisting like the fingers of an ancient hand. Nestled among the roots was a rusted metal box, its surface covered in moss and dirt. John crouched down, his hands trembling as he reached for the box. It was heavier than he expected, and the lid was stuck fast. "Help me," he said, and Mary knelt beside him, the two of them working together to pry it open. When the lid finally gave way, they gasped in unison. Inside was a collection of items that seemed to span generations. A locket containing a faded photograph of a young couple, a stack of letters tied with a ribbon, their edges brittle with age, and a journal, its leather cover cracked and worn. Mary reached for the journal first, her fingers brushing over the cover reverently. "This must be theirs," she said softly. John nodded, his eyes fixed on the photograph. "It's them," he said, holding it up. "It's Henry and Beatrice. I'd bet anything on it." As they began to sift through the contents of the box, the story of Henry and Beatrice began to unfold. The letters were love notes, written in a flowing script that matched the handwriting in the book. They spoke of secret meetings, stolen kisses, and a love that defied the conventions of their time. The journal, written by Beatrice, chronicled their struggles and triumphs, painting a vivid picture of a couple who had risked everything to be together. "They were remarkable," Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. "They didn't just live, they fought for the kind of life they believed in." John nodded, his throat tight. For the first time, he felt a deep connection to these long-gone relatives, as though their courage and passion had somehow been passed down through the generations. But not everything in the box was romantic or nostalgic. One letter, tucked beneath the others, hinted at a darker side to their story. It spoke of threats from Beatrice's family, who disapproved of their union, and of a decision that had left them forever changed. "We must leave this place," the letter read. "It is no longer safe. But we will take with us the one thing they cannot destroy: our love." Mary's brow furrowed as she read the words aloud. "What do you think they meant?" she asked. John shook his head, his mind reeling. "I don't know," he said, "but I think this is only the beginning." As they packed up the box and made their way back to the car, their thoughts were heavy with unanswered questions. Who were Henry and Beatrice, really? What had driven them to such desperate measures? And how had their story been lost to time, only to resurface in the form of a yard sale book? Mary and John couldn't know it yet, but their journey into the past was far from over. The discoveries they had made so far were just the first few chapters of a tale that would challenge everything they thought they knew about love, family, and the enduring power of memory. Back at home, the box and its contents became the centerpiece of Mary and John's lives. The locket, letters, and journal felt like relics from another world, a world that, despite its distance, seemed to call out to them with an almost haunting familiarity. Every evening, they would sit together at the kitchen table, poring over Beatrice's journal and deciphering the faded letters. Each word seemed to breathe life into Henry and Beatrice, painting a vivid picture of a love that was as fierce as it was forbidden. But as the story unfolded, it became clear that their love was shadowed by secrets that had been deliberately buried, only to resurface generations later. One evening, as the autumn wind rattled the windows, Mary read aloud a passage from Beatrice's journal. Her voice wavered, not from the cold, but from the weight of the words. "They say love is enough, but they do not understand what we face. Our love must remain hidden, for the world is not yet ready to see it for what it is." If they ever knew. Mary's voice trailed off, her eyes meeting John's. "What do you think she means?" she asked, her brow furrowed. John leaned back in his chair, his fingers steepled as he thought. "I don't know," he admitted. "But whatever it was, it must have been big enough to risk everything for." As they continued reading, the pieces of the puzzle began to fall into place. Henry was the son of a prominent local politician, a man whose reputation was built on strict adherence to societal norms. Beatrice, on the other hand, came from a family of immigrants who had struggled to establish themselves in a new land. The letters revealed the depth of the prejudice they faced, not just from society, but from their own families. "Your love is a stain on our name," read one letter from Henry's father, its words seething with anger. "If you insist on this foolishness, you will be disowned." Mary's hand trembled as she held the fragile paper. "They were willing to give up everything," she murmured, her voice tinged with awe. But it wasn't just their families that stood in their way. One letter from Beatrice to Henry spoke of threats from an unnamed individual, someone who seemed determined to keep them apart. "He knows about us," the letter read. "I saw him watching us in the park. He said he would ruin us if we didn't end this." John frowned, his mind racing. "Who's he?" he wondered aloud. Mary shook her head, her eyes scanning the letter for clues. "Whoever it was, they must have had a lot of power," she said. "Enough to make them run." The journal confirmed their suspicions. In the final entries, Beatrice wrote of their decision to leave everything behind and start a new life elsewhere. "We cannot stay," she wrote. "The world here is too small, too cruel. But we will carry our love with us, no matter where we go." Mary closed the journal, her heart heavy with emotion. "They sacrificed so much," she said softly. John nodded, his eyes distant. "And they never got to tell their story," he added. "Until now." But as they dug deeper, the story took an unexpected turn. Tucked inside the final pages of the journal was a folded piece of paper, its edges brittle with age. Mary unfolded it carefully, revealing a sketch of a small house surrounded by trees. Beneath the sketch were the words, "Our haven, where the past cannot find us." John's eyes widened. "Do you think it's the place from the coordinates?" he asked. Mary shook her head. "No," she said. "This looks different. More secluded." She pointed to a small note scribbled in the corner of the page. Larchmont. Larchmont was a tiny town several states away, barely more than a dot on the map. Intrigued, Mary and John decided to investigate. They scoured online records and reached out to local historical societies, hoping to find any mention of Henry and Beatrice. Their efforts paid off when a librarian from Larchmont emailed them a scanned newspaper clipping from 1877. The headline read, "Mysterious couple found dead in forest clearing, suspected double suicide." Mary's blood ran cold as she read the article aloud. The story described a young couple who had been discovered clutching hands beneath an oak tree, their faces serene despite the tragedy. "It's them," she whispered, her voice barely audible. John shook his head, his heart pounding. "It can't be," he said. "They wouldn't." But the evidence was undeniable. The names matched, as did the description of the locket found with them, a locket identical to the one now sitting on their kitchen table. Mary and John stared at each other, the weight of the revelation sinking in. "Why didn't anyone in your family ever mention this?" Mary asked. John shrugged, his expression conflicted. "Maybe they didn't know," he said. "Or maybe they wanted to forget." As the days passed, the discovery raised more questions than answers. What had driven Henry and Beatrice to such a desperate end? Was it the relentless pressure from their families and society, or was there something darker at play? The more Mary and John learned, the more they realized how little they truly understood. "It feels like we're uncovering a story that was never meant to be told," Mary said one evening, her voice tinged with unease. John nodded, his gaze fixed on the locket in his hand. "But maybe that's why it's so important," he said. "Because it deserves to be told." Their search for the truth became an obsession. They scoured historical records, tracked down distant relatives, and even visited the Larchmont Historical Society in person. Each new discovery brought them closer to understanding the lives of Henry and Beatrice, but it also revealed the depth of the tragedy that had consumed them. Mary couldn't shake the feeling that the book, the journal, and the locket were all part of something larger, something that had been waiting for them to uncover it. One night, as they sat surrounded by papers and photographs, Mary looked up at John with a determined expression. "We have to finish this," she said. "Not just for them, but for us, for our family. If we don't, their story will disappear forever." John nodded, his resolve matching hers. "Then let's make sure it doesn't," he said. Together, they made a vow to uncover the full truth, no matter where it led them. And as they turned their attention back to the book, they couldn't shake the feeling that the most shocking revelations were still to come. Mary and John's resolve to uncover the truth about Henry and Beatrice was unwavering, but their journey began to test them in ways they hadn't anticipated. As they delved deeper into the archives, piecing together the lives of these two star-crossed lovers, they began to encounter fragments of their own family's past, fragments that didn't align with the warm, idyllic stories passed down at holiday dinners. There were whispers of feuds, accusations of betrayal, and hints of a scandal that had divided the family so deeply that parts of it had been erased from the collective memory. Each discovery felt like a thread unraveling a once pristine tapestry, leaving Mary and John to wonder whether some stories were meant to stay buried. One evening, Mary sat cross-legged on the floor of their living room, surrounded by boxes of documents they had retrieved from distant relatives and historical societies. She held up an old, faded letter, her voice trembling as she read aloud, "It is better this way. The truth can only bring shame, and we must think of the children." She looked up at John, who was seated at the dining table, staring at a photograph of Henry and Beatrice they had found in an old family album. Shame, she repeated softly. They weren't just hiding their love. They were hiding something else, something bigger. John sighed, leaning back in his chair. What if we're opening a door we can't close? He asked, his tone heavy with doubt. What if this story isn't the one we've been hoping for? Mary set the letter down and met his gaze. But it's their story, she said firmly. And it's ours too. Don't we have a responsibility to tell it, no matter what we find? Her words hung in the air, and for a moment, the only sound was the soft rustling of the wind outside. John nodded slowly, though his heart felt heavy. You're right, he said. But what if the truth changes everything we thought we knew about who we are? The question lingered as they continued their search. Days turned into weeks, and the picture of Henry and Beatrice's lives grew both clearer and more complicated. They discovered that Henry's father, the prominent politician, had been embroiled in a corruption scandal that nearly destroyed his career. The timing of the scandal coincided with Henry and Beatrice's disappearance, raising questions about whether the young couple had been caught in the crossfire. Meanwhile, Beatrice's letters revealed a darker side to her family's disapproval. Threats of violence, manipulation, and even blackmail. They were under so much pressure, Mary said one evening, tears welling in her eyes. How could anyone expect them to survive that? But the most shocking revelation came when they uncovered a long-lost legal document hidden among the papers in Henry's father's estate. It was a birth certificate dated 1876, the same year Henry and Beatrice fled. The child's name was listed as Margaret Hope, and the parents were identified as Henry B. and Beatrice M. Mary stared at the document, her hand shaking. They had a child, she whispered. They had a daughter. John's eyes widened as he processed the information. But why didn't she stay with them? He asked. The answer came in the form of a second document, a legal agreement transferring custody of the child to Beatrice's sister. For her safety, the note appended to the agreement read, "The revelation changed everything." Henry and Beatrice's story was no longer just a tale of forbidden love. It was a story of sacrifice. They had given up their child to protect her, to ensure that she could grow up free from the stigma and danger that surrounded them. But their decision also raised a painful question for Mary and John. Should they reveal this part of the story to their family? The child, Margaret, had gone on to marry and have children of her own, children whose descendants were still alive today. If they shared what they had learned, it could bring closure and a sense of pride in Henry and Beatrice's bravery, but could also stir up pain and conflict, reopening wounds that had long since healed. One night, as they sat together in the glow of a single lamp, Mary voiced the dilemma that had been weighing on both of them. If we tell the family, she said, it could change the way they see everything. Their parents, their grandparents, maybe even themselves. Are we ready for that? John rubbed his temples, his thoughts a storm of conflicting emotions. If we don't tell them, he replied, we're deciding for them. Isn't that just as wrong? Mary nodded, her heart heavy with the weight of the decision. But what if it hurts them? She asked softly. What if it breaks them? They debated late into the night, each argument leaving them more uncertain than before. On one hand, the story of Henry and Beatrice deserved to be told in its entirety. It was a story of courage, love, and sacrifice, and it had the power to inspire generations to come. On the other hand, the truth was complicated, messy, and potentially painful. It wasn't just their story, it was the family's story. And the family had a right to decide how much of it they wanted to carry. In the end, they decided to seek advice from a trusted family elder, John's great-aunt Eleanor, a woman in her 90s who had long been the keeper of the family's oral history. They visited her one Sunday afternoon, bringing the book, the journal, and the box of documents with them. Eleanor listened intently as they recounted their journey, her wrinkled hands folded neatly in her lap. When they finished, she sat in thoughtful silence for a long time before finally speaking. "The truth," she said slowly, "is a powerful thing. It can heal, but it can also wound. You must decide which it is more likely to do in this case." Her words stayed with them as they drove home, the box sitting quietly in the back seat. They knew they were at a crossroads, and whatever decision they made would have far-reaching consequences. Mary leaned her head against the window, watching the countryside blur past, and thought about Henry and Beatrice. They had faced impossible choices, sacrificing their own happiness for the sake of their child. Now, generations later, Mary and John faced a choice of their own, a choice that would determine how their story would be remembered. Days after their visit to Aunt Eleanor, Mary and John were no closer to a decision. The weight of Henry and Beatrice's story, and its implications for their family, seemed to grow heavier with each passing hour. They spent their evenings surrounded by the artifacts of a love story, both beautiful and tragic, their conversations circling endlessly around the same questions. Should they share everything, even the painful parts? Or should they protect their family from truths that might do more harm than good? The strain was palpable, and they both began to feel as though they were living more in the past than the present. Then, one crisp autumn afternoon, a knock on the door disrupted their endless cycle of debate. John answered it to find a man in his late 50s standing on their porch. He was sharply dressed in a tailored suit, his polished shoes gleaming in the sunlight. "Good afternoon," the man said with a warm smile. "My name is Edward Hastings. I'm a collector of rare books and historical artifacts, and I believe you might have something of interest to me." John blinked, caught off guard. "I'm sorry, but how did you?" The man held up a hand, his expression apologetic. "I realize this is unexpected. May I come in?" "I'd be happy to explain." Mary joined them in the living room, her eyes narrowing as she studied their unexpected visitor. Edward sat with perfect poise, his movements deliberate and confident, as though he was used to commanding attention. "I understand you recently came into possession of a rather unique book," he began, his gaze flickering to the green leather-bound volume resting on the coffee table. "It's a piece I've been searching for, and I'd very much like to acquire it." Mary and John exchanged a glance, their unease growing. "How did you even know we had it?" Mary asked, her tone cautious. Edward's smile didn't falter. "Books like that don't go unnoticed for long," he said. "I have connections in the world of rare collectibles, and when I heard about a yard sale in your area that featured an unusual find, I decided to investigate. Imagine my surprise when I discovered its connection to the Bennett family." He paused, his eyes locking onto John's. "Your family." John felt a chill run down his spine. "And why do you want it?" he asked. Edward leaned forward slightly, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Because it's more than just a book," he said. "It's a piece of history, your history. But it's also a piece of literary history. The notes in the margins, the hidden compartment, the letters, they all point to a deeper significance. This book was part of something larger, and I want to preserve it in the right hands." Mary frowned, her instincts telling her there was more to the story. "What do you mean by something larger?" she asked. Edward hesitated, as though weighing how much to reveal. "Have you ever heard of the Lost Poets Society?" he asked. Mary and John shook their heads. Edward's eyes gleamed with excitement as he continued. It was a secret group of writers, thinkers, and artists who operated in the late 19th century. They used their work to challenge societal norms, often at great personal risk. Henry Bennett was one of them. The revelation stunned them both. "Henry was a writer?" John asked, his voice barely above a whisper. Edward nodded. "Not just a writer," he said. "A revolutionary. The poems in that book were part of his legacy, and the notes in the margins reveal his contributions to the society's cause." It's a significant historical artifact, and I'd like to ensure it's preserved properly." Mary folded her arms, her skepticism unshaken. "And by preserved properly, you mean sold to the highest bidder?" she asked pointedly. Edward smiled, unruffled. "Not at all," he said. "I'd like to donate it to a museum where it can be studied and appreciated. Of course, I'm willing to compensate you handsomely for it." He reached into his pocket and produced a checkbook. "Name your price." The offer hung in the air, tantalizing and unsettling all at once. Mary and John stared at each other, the weight of the decision pressing down on them. The money could change their lives, allowing them to pay off debts, travel, or secure their future. But the idea of parting with a book, of giving up the last tangible connection to Henry and Beatrice, felt like a betrayal. "We'll need time to think about it," John said finally. Edward nodded graciously. "Of course," he said, standing. "Take all the time you need. But I would advise against waiting too long. Opportunities like this don't come around often." After he left, the house felt unnaturally quiet. Mary sat down heavily, her eyes fixed on the book. "What do you think?" she asked. John sighed, running a hand through his hair. "I think he's right about one thing," he said. "This book is bigger than us, but I don't know if we can trust him." Mary nodded, her thoughts a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. If he's telling the truth, this could be a way to honor Henry and Beatrice's legacy, she said. But what if he's not? What if we give it away and their story is lost forever? The question haunted them for days. Edward called twice to follow up, his tone polite but insistent. Each time, John thanked him for his patience and promised they were still considering his offer. But the truth was, they were no closer to a decision. Mary spent hours researching the Lost Poets Society, uncovering fragments of its history that seemed to corroborate Edward's claims. But the more she learned, the more she felt torn. The book was a treasure, both to their family and to history. Could they trust a stranger to handle it with the care it deserved? In the end, they decided to meet with Edward one more time. This time, they came prepared, armed with questions and conditions. "If we agree to let you have the book," John said firmly, "we want guarantees. We want to know exactly where it's going, and we want to ensure that Henry and Beatrice's story is told in its entirety." Edward smiled, his demeanor as calm and polished as ever. "Of course," he said, "their story deserves to be told. And I assure you, I will treat this book with the respect it deserves." But as they shook hands, Mary couldn't shake the feeling that they were making a mistake. The book had brought them this far, had connected them to a history they never knew existed. Was it really theirs to give away? Or did they have a greater responsibility to protect it, even if it meant keeping it in their own hands? As they watched Edward drive away, Mary and John were left with more questions than answers. And deep in the pit of her stomach, Mary felt the faintest flicker of doubt, a sense that the story was far from over. 2 days after Edward Hastings left with his promises and polished charm, Mary still couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The check he'd left them, though generous enough to change their lives, remained untouched on the kitchen counter, a silent reminder of the crossroads they faced. Every time she walked past it, her stomach twisted with unease. "I feel like we missed something," she confessed to John that evening as they sat on the couch, the green leather-bound book resting between them. John looked at her, his brow furrowed. "Missed what?" he asked. Mary shrugged, her eyes fixed on the book. "I don't know. It just feels like there's more to this story, something we're not seeing." John sighed, leaning forward to pick up the book. They had read through it so many times that he had nearly memorized the notes and the margins, the dedication, even the faint tea-colored stains on some of the pages. "We've gone over this thing 100 times," he said, flipping through the fragile pages. "If there was something else, wouldn't we have found it by now?" Mary didn't respond. Instead, she reached for the book, her fingers brushing over its spine. Something about the way it felt in her hands gave her pause. She tilted it under the light, studying the seam where they had previously discovered the hidden compartment. That's when she noticed it, a tiny thread of stitching barely visible, running along the inside of the back cover. "John, look," she said, her voice suddenly sharp with excitement. He leaned closer, his eyes narrowing as he followed her gaze. "What is that?" he asked. Mary shook her head, her pulse quickening. "I don't know, but I think it's another compartment." Without hesitation, she grabbed a small pair of scissors from the coffee table and began carefully cutting the stitches. The thread gave way easily, revealing a narrow pocket sewn into the binding. Inside was a folded piece of paper, so fragile it felt like it might disintegrate in her hands. "What is it?" John asked, his voice low. Mary unfolded the paper slowly, her hands trembling. The handwriting was the same elegant script they had come to associate with Henry and Beatrice. The note was brief, but its contents were enough to take their breath away. "To the finder of this book, if you have come this far, then you have uncovered the truth of our love. But there is one more secret to be revealed. Look beneath the oak where our hearts rest, and you will find the answer. Do not let our story fade into silence." Mary stared at the note, her mind racing. "The oak," she whispered. "It has to mean the tree where she trailed off, the memory of the newspaper clipping flashing in her mind." John nodded, his jaw tight. "Where they were found," he said grimly. The room fell silent as they absorbed the weight of the message. For all their efforts, for all the secrets they had uncovered, it seemed Henry and Beatrice had left one final piece of their story buried, literally. "We have to go back," Mary said finally, her voice steady. John hesitated, his eyes searching hers. "Are you sure?" he asked. "What if it's nothing? What if it's too late to find anything?" Mary shook her head, determination flickering in her eyes. "They wanted us to find it," she said. "They've been guiding us this whole time. We owe it to them to see this through." The next morning, they packed the car with shovels, gloves, and flashlights, preparing for whatever they might find. The drive back to the clearing in Washington felt both familiar and surreal, as though they were retracing the steps of a dream. The forest was just as they remembered it, quiet, still, and filled with an almost otherworldly sense of peace. When they reached the oak tree, Mary stood beneath its sprawling branches, the note clutched tightly in her hand. "This is it," she said softly. "This is where they wanted us to look." John began digging at the base of the tree, his movements slow and deliberate. Mary knelt beside him, her hands working alongside his. The soil was packed tightly, but as they dug deeper, it began to loosen, revealing something solid buried beneath the roots. "There's something here," John said, his voice thick with emotion. Together, they cleared away the dirt, uncovering a small metal box, much like the one they had found before. This one, however, was locked. Mary held the box in her lap, her heart pounding. "Do we even have a way to open it?" she asked. John examined it closely, noticing a small keyhole on the front. "Wait," he said suddenly. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the locket they had found in the first box. On a hunch, he twisted the locket open, revealing a tiny, hidden compartment. Inside was a small, tarnished key. Mary's eyes widened as she handed the box to John, her breath catching in her throat. "Try it," she urged. The key fit perfectly. With a soft click, the box unlocked, and John lifted the lid. Inside was a bundle of letters tied with a ribbon, a few faded photographs, and a leather-bound journal. The letters were addressed to their daughter, Margaret, written by Henry and Beatrice during the years they were on the run. Each letter was filled with love, regret, and hope, their words painting a picture of two people who had sacrificed everything for the sake of their child. One letter, in particular, stood out. It was addressed to our family many years from now, and it carried a message that brought tears to Mary's eyes. We are not ashamed of our love. We are not ashamed of the choices we made. If you are reading this, it means our story has found its way to you. Remember us not for the pain we endured, but for the love that carried us through. Tell our story so that others may know that love is worth fighting for. Mary and John sat beneath the oak tree, their hands intertwined as they read the letters and journal. The forest seemed to hold its breath around them, as though the world itself was listening to Henry and Beatrice's story. They were incredible, Mary said, her voice thick with emotion. John nodded, his throat tight. And they wanted us to know, he said. They wanted their story to be part of ours. As they packed up the box and prepared to leave, Mary felt a sense of peace she hadn't known in weeks. The doubts and questions that had plagued her seemed to fade, replaced by a quiet certainty. Henry and Beatrice's story wasn't just about the past, it was about the present and the future. It was a reminder that love, in all its forms, was the most powerful legacy anyone could leave behind. The ride home from the forest was quiet, the weight of the discovery settling over Mary and John like a thick, invisible blanket. The box they had unearthed sat in the back seat, its contents a fragile testament to Henry and Beatrice's courage, their sacrifice, and the enduring love that had driven them to defy an unforgiving world. As the miles passed, neither Mary nor John spoke, their thoughts too tangled and heavy to put into words. By the time they pulled into their driveway, the late afternoon sun was sinking low on the horizon, casting long shadows that seemed to echo the deep questions still lingering in their minds. Once inside, they placed the box carefully on the kitchen table, alongside the green leather-bound book and the first set of artifacts they had found. Mary ran her fingers over the edges of the journal, the letters, and the photographs, her heart aching with the gravity of it all. They trusted us with this, she said softly, breaking the silence. They trusted us to tell their story. John nodded, though his expression was conflicted. But how do we tell it, he asked. And to who? To the family? To the world? Or do we keep it between us? That was the question that had haunted them from the moment they found the first note. Every step of the journey had brought them closer to the truth, but it had also forced them to confront the complexity of what it meant to honor someone's legacy. Henry and Beatrice's story wasn't just theirs anymore. It was tied to the broader family, to history, and to the choices Mary and John now had to make. The next morning, they called a family meeting, inviting John's siblings, cousins, and a few older relatives to gather at their home. It wasn't the entire family, just the ones they felt would understand the gravity of what they were about to share. The living room buzzed with curiosity and quiet chatter as everyone settled in. Mary and John stood at the front of the room, the green book and the boxes of artifacts laid out on a small table beside them. "Thank you all for coming," John began, his voice steady but tinged with nerves. "We've discovered something about our family, something that changes everything we thought we knew about where we come from." He paused, glancing at Mary, who gave him an encouraging nod. "It started with this book," he continued, holding it up for everyone to see. "We found it at a yard sale, and at first we thought it was just a coincidence. But as we dug deeper, we realized it's part of a much bigger story, a story about love, sacrifice, and the courage to defy the odds." As they shared what they had uncovered, the room fell silent. Mary read aloud passages from Beatrice's journal, her voice trembling with emotion, while John showed the letters and photographs. When they revealed the birth certificate and the letters to Margaret, gasps rippled through the room. "They had a child," one of John's cousins asked, her voice filled with disbelief. "Why didn't we ever know this?" John nodded, his expression somber. "Because they didn't want us to," he said. "They gave her up to protect her, to protect the family from the stigma of their love." The reaction was mixed. Some family members were moved to tears, overwhelmed by the bravery and tragedy of Henry and Beatrice's story. Others were more hesitant, their expressions wary. "Are we sure this is something we want to bring to light?" one of John's uncles asked. "What if it tarnishes the family name? What if people judge us for it?" Mary stepped forward, her voice calm but resolute. "This isn't about judgment," she said. "It's about truth. And it's about honoring the choices they made, the sacrifices they endured, for the sake of love." The room fell quiet again, the weight of her words sinking in. For the next hour, they debated, wrestled with questions of legacy, and tried to imagine how Henry and Beatrice might feel about their story being shared. In the end, the consensus was clear. The family wanted the story to be told, but in a way that honored their ancestors' bravery and dignity. They agreed to create a family archive, preserving the letters, photographs, and journals as a testament to Henry and Beatrice's love. And they decided to share the story more broadly, perhaps through a book, a documentary, or a museum exhibit that could inspire others to see the power of love and the importance of standing up for what you believe in. But there was one final twist, one that neither Mary nor John had anticipated. As they were packing up the artifacts later that evening, Mary noticed something unusual about the ribbon tying the letters together. It was old and frayed, but as she untied it, she realized it was more than just a decorative touch. Woven into the fabric were tiny, stitched initials, HB and BM. She ran her fingers over the letters, her heart pounding. "John," she whispered, holding up the ribbon. "Look at this." John's eyes widened as he studied it. "They made this," he said. It's like a symbol of their bond." But there was more. As Mary examined the letters again, she noticed a faint watermark on the paper, an emblem that matched the stitching on the ribbon. It was the symbol of the Lost Poets Society, confirming Edward Hastings' claim that Henry had been part of the group. "They weren't just fighting for their love," Mary said, her voice trembling. "They were fighting for something bigger, for the right to express themselves, to challenge the world's prejudices, and to leave behind a legacy of courage and creativity." In that moment, Mary and John knew they had made the right choice. By sharing Henry and Beatrice's story, they weren't just preserving their family's history. They were carrying forward a message of hope, resilience, and the enduring power of love. And as they sat together, the green leather-bound book resting between them, they felt a profound sense of peace, knowing that the past had finally found its voice.